Sometimes you try something new just to see what will happen, and occasionally things just keep going wrong, it just doesn't work out. This is one of those occasions. Hey there, cheese historians! I'm Julia and welcome to Cheese History, a channel all about the origins, history and impact of cheese. Today, instead of talking about the history of cheese, I'm going to attempt to adapt a 150-year-old method for making Camembert to what I have available to me as a home cheesemaker and see what sort of cheese I get out of it. I have a whole episode on the history of Camembert, so make sure you have watched that one so this one makes more sense. In brief, Camembert began its rise to fame in the 19th century thanks to the clever marketing of the Paynels, the descendants of Marie Herrel, who they claimed invented Camembert in the 1790s. They were notoriously secretive about their cheesemaking methods, but luckily for us, some broad descriptions of the process have survived, and it is those descriptions that I'm going to use to make this cheese. Just a note before we begin. I live in New Zealand, rather than Normandy in France, and everything I have access to is different to what an actual French Camembert de Normandy cheesemaker does. To begin with, I don't have access to raw milk. The milk I have access to is not from the same type of cows as Camembert is made from, and I make cheese in my kitchen rather than in a factory, and age it either in a temperature-controlled wine fridge or just a normal refrigerator, rather than a series of drying and aging rooms. So the point of this video is not to show how real Camembert can be made at home by anyone who wants to. Instead, my goal is to take the descriptions of the process that I've found and see if I can translate them as best I can into my home cheese making setup and then see what kind of cheese that makes. Spoiler, it makes a terrible cheese. In his book Camembert, A National Myth, Pierre Boisard describes the process for making Camembert used by Cyril Paynel, based on an account written by Jules Moret, who visited Paynel's factory in 1856 and 1878. He also includes some information by Armand Florent Poirier, who wrote an account in 1872 of how a different Camembert maker made his cheese. Where possible, I've tried to focus on what Paynel was doing in his factory. As with all cheese making, we have to start with milk. After the milk has rested for 2 or 3 hours, a thin layer of cream that has risen to the top is carefully lifted off with an incremate, or creamer, a utensil resembling a pierced scoop. The milk collected at the evening's milking is set in a cool place. The next morning it is lightly skimmed and then mixed with the unskimmed milk from the morning milking. This method yields milk with a fat content of approximately 30%. The evening milk has been acidified by lactic fermentation, but the acidity must be controlled, and overly acidic milk should be set aside. At the moment, I only have access to pasteurised cow's milk, so I did a number of things to try to recreate some of the circumstances described here. The 30% fat content confused me because whole milk is typically around 3.25%, so skimming cream off it is not going to increase the fat content. The pasteurised, unhomogenised milk I have access to is around 4% fat. Camembert de Normandy is made with milk of Normand cows, which have a fat content of around 4.4%, so I didn't end up skimming any fat off the milk, as the level was already lower. For this Camembert I used 4 litres of milk. 2 litres I heated to 38 degrees centigrade or 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Added a small amount of mesophilic culture to make up for the pasteurization. And I left it at room temperature overnight. The room temperature was about 24 degrees centigrade, and I ended up leaving it for 15 hours. I clearly failed on the leave it in a cool place part of the instructions, and the next morning the milk had coagulated, so wasn't usable anymore. So I had to start again. I decided to use the opportunity to make a few changes. So I heated the milk to 38 degrees centigrade again, this time added both mesophilic and thermophilic cultures. My thinking was that both will be present in raw milk, and the higher temperatures would result in some acidification by the thermophilic culture, which would impact the end result. This time I kept a closer eye on how acidic the milk was becoming by measuring the pH every 2 hours. After 6 hours, I added another 2 liters of milk, reheated the milk to 38 degrees centigrade, 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and added the same amount of culture as I did to the original 2 liters, as well as some Penicillium candidum, which is the white mold that grows on the surface of Camembert. I added a few mils of calcium chloride because I'm using pasteurised milk. After this preparatory phase comes the rennet phase, during which a small amount of rennet, an enzyme distilled from the lining of a calf's fourth stomach that serves to enhance the curdling process, is added to the milk cans. There is no set amount of rennet or exact length of time involved in the process. The operation was carried out at the same temperature as the new milk, or approximately 38 degrees centigrade, 100 degrees Fahrenheit. In order that the rennet should be evenly distributed throughout the milk, the mixture was stirred for about 2 minutes with a large spoon. A wooden cover was placed over each container. At Paynel's dairy, the curdling process required 5 or 6 hours. In order to get a curd that takes 6 hours, I took the usual amount of rennet I use when I make Camembert and quartered it. This is because normally this Camembert rennets for around 1.5 hours, so to rennet for 6 hours, I assumed it needed a fourth of the amount of rennet. Of course, with the acidity of the milk already changed by letting it sit for 6 hours on the bench, I figured this might impact the renneting time, so I decided to use the flocculation method to figure out how long it took for the curd to initially set, and I hoped that this would take 1 hour. It took 25 minutes rather than an hour for the milk to begin setting, which was much quicker than I expected. This ended up reducing the renneting time to 2.5 hours rather than 6. When the cheesemaker estimates that the curdling process has reached the proper stage, the moulding process immediately begins. The dairy woman doing the moulding uses a special tool to lift the curd gently from the container and into the mould without breaking it. The operation calls for speed and skill, for the curd must not sit too long in its tank and must not be broken up. The moulder starts at the outer edge of the container and works around the circumference, continuing in a spiral path until she reaches the center. She then does the same with the succeeding layers. A mould will contain 4 to 5 spoonfuls of curd. It takes from 45 minutes to an hour between each addition for the curds to drain without pressure. The temperature in the moulding room should be approximately 18 degrees centigrade, 64.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Once the curd's set, it has to be ladled into the moulds. I have 4 Camembert moulds, and usually 4 liters of milk is enough to fill them. The process Boisard outlines calls for 45 minutes to an hour between the ladles full of curd and 4 to 5 spoonfuls per mould. This seems to be because of the scale being undertaken here. I filled the moulds with as much curd as possible before waiting for them to drain a bit and then topping them up. It took about an hour to fit all the curds in the moulds. A day after it has been moulded, or the same evening if it was moulded in the early morning, the cheese is carefully turned. On the following day, the mould is removed and the cheese is salted. So the next day I turned the cheese. Things went slightly wrong here because the bottom layer of curds stuck to the bottom of the mould and I had to scrape it off. I put the rest of the cheese on top of it in the hopes that some of it would stick. And I also gave them an extra turn to try and help them form something vaguely camembert shaped, as they were now all starting to look a bit wonky. If I did this again, I would turn them after a few hours of draining because my moulds have bases on them, and I think turning them a little bit earlier should prevent the curds from sticking to those bases. The final step was to remove the cheeses from the moulds and salt them. Boisard didn't include any indication of how much salt was used, so I'll use the same amount that I usually do for Camembert, sprinkled on both sides, and kind of hope it's enough. The salted cheeses are then set on wooden shelves above draining tables. They will stay there for 1 to 4 days before being taken into the drying chamber, where they will sit on straw-covered racks for 20 to 25 days. Throughout that period they will be turned, first on a daily basis and then every other day, in order for the cheeses to age properly. The drying chamber must have sufficient air circulation. On the 3rd day, the cheeses will begin to form small brown spots, and then a white coating that takes on a bluish tinge. At the end of the aging process, some red spots appear. When the cheeses become soft, they are removed from the chamber. Once placed in the cellar, the cheeses continue to age for 20 to 30 days at a temperature of 12 to 14 degrees centigrade, 53.6 to 57.2 degrees Fahrenheit. They are set on wooden slabs and arranged by age. They are turned every day or every other day. During this phase, additional red patches will form on the surface and take on an increasingly intense colour as the interior becomes increasingly soft. All in all, the fabrication of a Camembert, aging included, takes 7 to 9 weeks. I planned to dry the cheese at room temperature for about 4 days if I could, but it took just 1 day before they started to grow white mould. The drying room is really hard to replicate in my current apartment, so I put lids on the containers and put them in my normal fridge because they were already starting to ripen really fast and I wanted a lower temperature to slow them down a bit. I basically decided that as I have 4 of these, I should check them regularly to see how they're ripening and how they taste. So after 3 weeks of aging, I tried the first one. The cheese felt soft around the edges, but a bit firmer in the middle. It also felt like there were air bubbles around the edges, which was not a good sign. On cutting it open, it was starting to go gooey around the edges, but it was still firm and sort of crumbly in the middle. So I figured I'd do a taste test to see how it was coming along. So now it's taste test time. We have to find out what this Camembert tastes like. So it looks kind of quite firm in the middle, which could be a sign that it's still a little bit underripe, but it is quite gooey around the edge. So it's going to be kind of interesting to see what it tastes like. Okay, so there's a lot of ammonia in the part of the cheese around the edge, and a lot of ammonia flavor, which is almost like it's overripe, but the central part where it's quite chalky is quite acidic, so it's almost underripe there. So I think it definitely needs to age a little bit longer to see if we can to see if it will turn out to be more of a sort of Camembert flavor than it currently is. It has notes of Camembert for sure, so it's getting there, but it's a little bit underripe in the middle at the moment, and possibly getting a bit too overripe on the outside. So this could be interesting. So after 3 weeks, it was not all that promising, but let's see what another couple of weeks will do. After 2 weeks more, it was time for the next taste test. This time the cheese was much squishier and was beginning to shrink down in the middle. It was gooey pretty much all the way through too, which I took as a positive sign. So it's been about 5 weeks since I made the Camembert, and about 2 weeks since I did the first taste test where it was really quite underripe. And here we have a piece of Camembert on a cracker as per usual. Now this time around it's much gooier than before. More or less the entirety of the inside of the Camembert has gone liquidy, so now we're going to see if it tastes any better than it did the first time round when it was very underripe and had hints of ammonia. So here we go. It's very bitter. It has the Camembert flavour to it, but there's also quite an intense bitterness at the start. It's not absolutely revolting, but it's also not really all that pleasant either. Well, it's definitely not what I was expecting. It's not what I was hoping for, and it's not. I mean, it's not all that similar to any Camembert I've tried. Now I haven't tried proper French Camembert because it's really hard to get hold of here in New Zealand. But I've tried many other different types of Camembert. I've made my own and let them get ridiculously overripe, where they get a very, very strong flavour. And none of them have quite tasted like this. It's definitely lost the ammonia flavour from when I tried it 2 weeks ago, when it was definitely underripe, and it doesn't have that sort of crumbliness to it, but it does have this very strange aftertaste now as well, which is hard to place but not that pleasant. I might as well eat the last bit, I suppose. Yeah, I got a tiny hint of ammonia in that time, and it really is. Yeah, one of my problems with Camembert is I always expect it to taste a little bit weird because it's not a cheese I naturally go towards. I always sort of second guess myself as to whether or not it's edible. But this is most certainly not pleasant. It's... yeah. Yeah, I think I did something wrong there. Okay, so this experiment didn't really work out as I expected. Things have pretty much gone wrong from the beginning. I left the first lot of milk too long and it coagulated. In the second attempt, I miscalculated the amount of rennet, and the cheese coagulated in 2.5 hours rather than 6. Then part of the cheese stuck to the mold, so I ended up with misshapen frankencheeses. And in the end, the final cheese was unpleasant and basically inedible. But you know what? Despite this not working out, I had lots of fun trying this out, and I learned a lot about how difficult it is to take a 150 or so year old set of instructions and try to follow them in a modern kitchen without access to raw milk and on a much smaller scale than the huge Norman Camembert factories of the 1870s. There are a couple of things I would do differently next time. I would only add the first quantity of cultures, because I think I added too much culture so the cheese got too acidic too early on. This would mean that after adding the second quantity of milk, I would only add the Penicillium Camemberti mold rather than also mesophilic and thermophilic cultures. This I think would help reduce the acidity of the overall cheese and hopefully help it age in a more reliable manner. I would also reduce the amount of rennet I used to a much smaller amount to see if I could extend the time it took for the milk to coagulate. I'll leave the exact amounts of rennet and cultures that I used in the video description so you can check that out if you're interested. The other thing I would change is that I would turn the cheeses more frequently once they're in the molds to stop them from sticking. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this historical cheese making experiment that didn't work out, and that it gave you some insight into how the Normans made Camembert, and at least one way how not to attempt to recreate it. And if you have any thoughts or suggestions about what I could have done differently, do let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and an especially big thank you to all my patrons over on Patreon. Thank you so much for all your support. I hope your next cheese experiment goes much better than mine just did, and I will see you around.